Monday. Who actually became wealthy during the Black Death? That question opens one of the darkest, yet most paradoxical stories in economic history. A plague can take millions of lives, sweeping away communities that had existed for centuries. Even in opportunity rarely disappears entirely. History shows that even the Black Death, the most devastating disaster of the Middle Ages, exception. From 1347 to 1315, the plague swept across Europe with a level of destruction humanity had never witnessed. Many towns vanished entirely from the map, leaving no trace of life behind. Some families were wiped out so completely that no one remembered they had ever existed. In just a few short years, half of Europe's population was swept away suddenly, horrifically. Yet beneath those unimaginable losses, another current was almost invisibly taking shape. A massive redistribution was underway, on a scale so large recessions seemed tiny. In comparison, the old elites collapsed, but space for new fortunes right amid the ashes of tragedy. Some of the families that would later become the most powerful may sound cruel, but it is a harsh truth. Even in a pandemic that claimed tens of millions of lives, some families suddenly became wealthier than ever. That is the unforgiving rule. Whenever a system collapses, someone will always step in to pick up what remains. The Black Death did not simply shake old them out almost entirely. The plague did not only kill peasants, merchants, or craftsmen. It also killed heirs and wiped out eliminated countless competitors, triggering the collapse of noble houses that had ruled for centuries. When enormous fortunes suddenly had no heirs, new owners inevitably appeared. Not because they were villains, but because in a collapsing opportunity and the drive to rise were too powerful to resist. To understand who truly became during wealthy, the Black Death, you must first imagine the weakest moment in its history. Ships arrived in Genoa carrying sailors already dead, not simply because no one was left alive to ring them. Entire settlements could become empty overnight. And while most documentaries end at that horror, our story begins there. Because what happened next was not a temporary shock, but a fundamental transformation of the entire economic system. The plague didn't just take lives, it swept away whole social classes that had existed for centuries. The labor force collapsed, breaking the foundations of feudalism. Farmland was abandoned, creating enormous ownership vacuums. Merchant networks also fell apart and had to be rebuilt. Banks collapsed as uncollectible debts destroyed their balance sheets across the financial system. From those openings, new winners began to emerge. At this point, did anyone become wealthy? No longer, but rather, who? Exactly who? And how did they do it? To answer that, we must follow many historians overlook the path of inheritance, the quiet consolidation of power. And to answer that question, we have to trace a path that many historians often overlook, the path of inheritance, of consolidating power, of the seemingly empty pauses that were actually filled with opportunity. Where half of Europe's rivals had vanished. The first discovery is this: some of the most famous names in European families associated with banking, nobility, and even empires rose to power directly from the economic void left by the plague. Nowhere illustrates this more clearly than the city of Florence. In the late 14th century, as the plague receded and returned in waves, Florence emerged as a city of survivors. Rivals died off one by one, trade networks collapsed, and banks struggled to stay afloat. And in that void, a man named Giovanni Medici stepped in. He was not a nobleman nor a celebrated figure, just an exceptionally sharp banker who appeared at the perfect moment. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank in 1397, right after the second major wave destabilized Florence's entire financial system. Many of the city's traditional banking families lost heirs, lost partners, or even entire branches. Two major houses, the Bardi and once the powerful international banks, were now only shadows of themselves. And Giovanni was the one who stepped in to fill that gap. The Medici Bank quickly secured lucrative contracts, including becoming the financial administrator for the Pope. This was an opportunity they likely would never have reached if the plague had not wiped out their competitors. And the story doesn't stop at that banking. The population collapse reduced the number of merchants competing for power. Many Medici family members almost naturally stepped into leadership roles in economic and civic affairs. Without the plague, they might have remained merely a wealthy family of Florence. Instead, they became the family that financed the Renaissance, placed their own members on the papal throne, ruled Tuscany, and laid the foundations of modern finance. You could even say, without Michelangelo might owe part of his career to the Black Death. But Florence was not the only example. Milan underwent an even more dramatic transformation. The ruling Visconti family not only survived the plague, but used the power vacuum it created as a weapon for expansion. When noble families died without heirs, something during a pandemic with mortality rates their lands reverted to higher lords or were seized by opportunistic rivals, and the Visconti family were masters of this game. Bonaparte Visconti expanded Milan's territory aggressively, seizing estates from families wiped out by the plague. His successor, Galeazzo Visconti, exploited both strategic marriages and the demographic chaos of the era to gather enough land and power to be crowned the first Duke in 1395. In another era, this kind of territorial might have required centuries of warfare. But after the Black Death, it took just one generation. When the nobility around you is collapsing, becoming the heir to multiple estates is no longer luck. It becomes almost statistically inevitable. If there were a gold medal for benefiting the most from the collapse of inheritance lines, the Visconti family would be a top contender. Crossing the English Channel, we witnessed the rise of an entirely new class, the emerging gentry. These were families outside the nobility who suddenly controlled enough land and wealth to become politically influential figures. And unlike the Medici or the Visconti, these names were not always famous in the modern era, which makes their story even more remarkable. Take the Peyton family, for example. They began as ordinary landowners in Norfolk, but when nearby estates lost their heirs because of the plague, the Peytons bought up land at unbelievably low prices or acquired ownership through lawsuits. Their sudden rise in wealth opened the door for them to education, the court system, and even royal patronage. Over generations, they became highly influential in public politics and society. Their rise is recorded in the famous Paston Letters, a vivid historical source that clearly depicts the shifting of social classes out of the population collapse, and they were not the only case. The De La Pole family also rose rapidly by combining their merchant wealth with the acquisition of abandoned land or properties sold off cheaply. The Neville family, who later became central figures in the Wars of the Roses, greatly expanded their estates and wealth thanks to the power vacuums left within the northern English nobility. Even the Stanley family, who later played a decisive role. The Battle of Bosworth also through land opportunities created by the plague, changes that helped reshape England's power structure. The economic tremors did not stop at Florence, Milan, or the rising gentry estates of England. The deeper we dig into the ruins of 14th century Europe, the clearer one rule becomes. Where death creates a void, someone will step in to fill it. Sometimes it was a noble family, sometimes a merchant dynasty, and sometimes a religious one that never had to worry about because its members had vowed to live in poverty. The plague spared no one, but wealth was distributed very unevenly. To see this more clearly, you have to look northward, toward the cold ports around the Baltic Sea, where the Hanseatic League was turning crisis. The Hanseatic League was not a country network, a commercial alliance of cities from Lubeck to Riga and onward to Bruges. And demand across Europe collapsed. Trade slowed, and maritime commerce came to a halt. Prices of essential goods soared. Merchants in Hanseatic ports entered this chaos with the cold precision of people who understood that scarcity is always the mother of profit. Families like the Varzin and the Gothlin of Warendorf expanded their fleets as many other merchants went bankrupt. They bought cheap grain from eastern regions untouched and sold it at massive profits. In cities in the west, devastated by disease, they gained monopolies in timber and salt, both essential commodities. Europe struggled to rebuild and leverage them to increase political influence in city councils. In a Europe where half the workforce had vanished, the Hanseatic cities grew wealthy by supplying what the survivors could no longer produce themselves. And scattered across the continent were another kind of institutions that did not die, even when the people inside them did. Monasteries, abbeys, became the largest landowners in Europe after the plague, not because they bought land, but because so much of it fell into their hands. When entire families died without heirs, when monks died without successors, when aging nobles donated their estates in exchange for spiritual salvation, the church quietly absorbed all that like a sponge. The Cistercians in France and the Benedictines expanded their wealth significantly during the years of the plague, and for many decades after that. It turned out that in a time when death spread everywhere, selling salvation became an extremely prosperous business. Survivors, seeking divine favor, poured in donations of land, livestock, vineyards, and even mills. The church didn't need to ask for ownership. People offered it willingly, and as secular estates were divided and dissolved, the church's estates only grew stronger. They were not just religious, economic institutions, collecting producing goods and shaping local economies. Although we often romanticize medieval piety, the Black Death revealed something far simpler. When people panic, they put their money into what feels eternal. But if there was one group that truly understood how to take advantage of economic chaos, it was the banking famous names spread across Italy. Strozzi or Pazzi did not appear out of nowhere. They rose in an economy where traditional banking corporations had been exhausted by bad loans that became unpayable because of the plague. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, once the most powerful international financiers collapsed in Europe under mountains of royal debts even before the plague arrived. The pandemic merely finished the job, wiping out their branches in Avignon, Bruges, and Constantinople. And it was in this financial crater that second-tier banking families stepped up, almost pushed upward by circumstance. The Strozzi family rebuilt their wealth by buying land so cheap it was practically a fire. The Pazzi family expanded their commercial banking operations as populations plummeted. The plague guaranteed no one would succeed. Guaranteed that many rivals in the medieval economy. Losing an heir meant losing the entire bank. Today, these families are hardly unknown. The Medici once ruled Tuscany. The Visconti dominated Milan, and the Neville family became a shaping force in the Wars of the Roses. The merchants of the Hanseatic League influenced northern Europe for centuries, while the Strozzi and Pazzi families appear in almost every book on the history of Florence. What is often forgotten in these stories is the mechanism behind their combination of death, scarcity, consolidation of power, and strategic opportunities created by the Black Death. And there were others who also emerged as winners, but were rarely called because their rise was less dramatic and happened quietly. These were labourers, peasants, and hired workers who survived. For the first time in centuries, the bargaining power of ordinary people, a labour shortage, pushed wages across Europe. Serfs began negotiating or even abandoning feudal obligations entirely. Laws had to be passed to halt wage inflation, and the 1351 labourers was a prime example of elites trying to use law to fight supply and demand. But the law could not override the natural forces of the market. Despite restrictions, wages kept rising. Class mobility also became more accessible. Guilds accepted more new members. Apprentices became journeymen far faster than tradition allowed before. And though this wasn't wealth in the elite sense, it was the closest medieval come to a moment of prosperity for the working class. In a brief moment of history, ordinary people leveraged and influence, something they had rarely possessed before. It was a silent revolution, born from the collapse of the population. If you want to grasp the deepest economic you have to look beyond medieval Europe. Because what happened in the 14th century was not unique at all. It is the blueprint of crisis economics. Wealth does not disappear in disaster. It simply changes hands. That rule repeats through every major crisis in history. During the 2008 financial crisis, investors specializing in distressed private equity firms grew more powerful than ever. During the COVID-19 pandemic, billionaires' wealth grew by trillions of dollars, countless small businesses closed forever. The tools may change. Structured finance instead of inheritance monopolies instead of grain cartels, but the mechanism remains the same. That is why studying the winners of plague economies is not merely curiosity about history. It reminds us that crisis does not level the field. Accelerates. Crisis amplifies existing advantages. Crisis rewards those with liquidity, connections, and adaptability. And it opens doors for those ready to act, while the rest of the world is still struggling to survive. If this journey into the hidden corners of plague economics has given you new insight, try imagining how many other moments in history quietly shaped the world you live in today. Follow, like, and share this video so more people can understand how not only in times of prosperity, but also in times of collapse. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future chapters.